have your Bible, pull out to John chapter 21 again. John 21. We'll pick up where we left off last night in a few moments. Well, it's been a week. And I just want to thank the elders here for the invitation. It's been about 8 years since I've been here. And Friday when I got the call about Mary, part of that was sad is boat right's part of the reason I'm here. It's the one that cornered me and kept nagging me about coming back. And I'm just thankful for the opportunity to study. I know that it's been an emotional week for you, and you all have been fantastic. I've appreciated getting to know Scott and his family, and so many of you that weren't here last time. I've appreciated Scott Foster's hospitality, which is weird to say, not Terry's, but she's out of town. People have asked how I knew Scott. We just know through a mutual friend. I think we're friends now. At least I hope so. He knows way too much now, but he's been fantastic. It's just been a great week. And again, can't be overstated just how it's been an odd week, but it's been good. And I just rejoice that I was able to be here with you. I told Heather and Scott, I think it was Sunday, that I hate the circumstances, but I'm also glad I could be here, and that's not necessarily true otherwise. So I was appreciative of that opportunity. Thank you so much, and I hope that if we're not together again here, I look forward to seeing you there and spending eternity with our God. I mean, when you think about the way that eternity is described, where there is no death or dying and no pain and no sorrow and no temptation and no guilt, and there's no need of light because God is the light. And one of the things I've always thought about, Scott and I were talking about this the other night, our faith will be sight. What an overwhelming thought that everything we have believed and thought of and hoped for will be realized. I long for that day, and I hope to see that. Last night we were in John 21, and we noticed how Peter and Jesus had this exchange. And it closes with Jesus predicting Peter's death. You'll die a martyr. You dress yourself, but the day's going to come when you're old that you'll stretch out your hands and somebody else will dress you and carry you. Pick up with me in verse 20. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. The one who also had leaned back against him during the supper and had said, "Lord, who is it that is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, "Lord, what about this man?" Jesus said to him, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me." So the saying spread abroad among the brothers and that this disciple was not to die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he was not to die, but if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is it? What is that to you? This is the disciple who's bearing witness about these things and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. Now there are also many other things that Jesus did, were every one of them to be written. I suppose that the world itself did not contain the books that would be written. Peter turns around and sees John, and he says, what about this man? What about him? What is John? What's going to happen to John, Lord? I'm sure that this question be motivated by a couple of reasons. Just a reminder that Peter and John are in the inner circle. We see them pulled aside with Jesus, Peter, James, and John, so often. The Garden of Gethsemane, one of those moments that we might think about. They were called together in Mark 1 and in Luke 5 to come and follow Jesus. Luke 5 in verses 9 through 11 tells us that they were partners together as fishermen. For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of the fish they'd taken, and so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid, from now on you will be catching men." And when they brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. That was Peter, Andrew, James, and John, all four of them. It's understandable maybe then with that history and that connection, and also I think what's revealed here, that John and Jesus seem to have a very special relationship. That Peter would say, "What about John?" And the question is, what does he mean by this question? Like, what is he saying? In one sense, it could be, okay, Lord, I'll feed your sheep, but what about John? If my assignment is to tend to the flock in your absence, what's John's assignment going to be doing? What's my former business partner, what's he's going to do here? I guess that could be one interpretation, although that doesn't seem likely. I think what is more likely is to connect this to the question that was, or to the statements in verses 18 through 19, where Jesus predicts how Peter is going to die. When you're old, you're going to die a martyr's death. Specifically, the prediction, by the way, is that he is going to be crucified. And the idea that he will die similarly to Jesus. And so when he looks back and says, what about John? It seems to be that he's saying, how's John going to die? If I'm going to be a martyr, what about him? And by the way, Jesus' answer seems to fit with that, doesn't it? Because his answer here is, if it's my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? If it's my will that John never dies, what is that to you? And it's interesting that it is said and spread about that the rumor in verse 23 is that John's not going to die, and John points out this isn't true. What he actually said is, if it's my will. And what you want you to see is that what Jesus is trying to say to Peter here is, doesn't matter what's going to happen to John, you follow me and do what I asked you to do. Can't help but think about another scene in the Gospels where the disciples, specifically Peter, fails to listen to Jesus. And it's in John 13 in the upper room where Jesus is washing the disciples' feet. And when he comes to Peter, it's interesting. I've always liked this interaction because it's so classic Peter. He comes to Simon Peter who says, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" Jesus answered him, "What I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." Get this, Jesus comes up, he's washing feet, and of course Peter's response is, "No, you're not." By the way, that should probably be our response. This was a disgusting job. The idea that the Son of God would wash your feet is not a good idea. It's kind of comparable to Jesus cleaning our bathroom. Peter says no, and Jesus says, if you don't let me do this, you get no part of it. So then Peter, classic fashion, it's not enough to just wash my feet. What does he say in verse 9? Well, Lord, not only my feet, but my hands and my head. Wash every part of me. Wash it all. And Jesus says, the one who's bathed does not need to wash, except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you. And I read that sometimes, I feel like Jesus is saying, Peter, listen to me. I'm just here to wash your feet. Submit to what I'm doing here. Let me wash your feet and nothing else. This scene to me is similar. Jesus has called Peter into his mission as a disciple and an apostle. And it should be pointed out that Jesus is really just repeating what he's already said to him. Here when he asks about, well, what about him? And Jesus says, What's that to you? Follow me. Didn't he just say last night, we looked at that passage where he said, follow me, and now Jesus is having to say it all over again. It's as if he's saying, stop looking at John. Peter, focus. Follow me. Follow me. Regardless of what's going to happen to John, or what role that Jesus had for John going forward, or what death there would be, Peter's command was to follow Jesus. Not worry about John, not worry about other people. In fact, he then says, what is that to you? It's my will that he remains till I come. What is that to you? Here's this close, intimate conversation, just the two of them, 3 denials answered by these 3 affirmations that Jesus accepts him as a disciple and commissions him going forward to tend and feed the sheep of God. And Peter immediately ruins the moment. It's classic Peter. Ruins the moment with Jesus. By the way, this is where, if it's me as Jesus, I'm extremely critical here. What do you mean, Peter, about John? John didn't do what you did. John didn't stand there and deny me 3 times. John didn't make the promises that you made. In fact, John was next to my mother, and I told him to take care of her, and he did. John did what I asked him to do. Instead, Jesus just says, doesn't matter. You do what I asked you to do. Stop comparing yourself to John. I remember when I would bring my report card home from school, my parents had high standards. If it was less than an A, we were made to feel like we had failed. Some of you may be that way. If you're that way, your parents treat you that way. That's extremely unfair, and your parents are abusive. And you should report them to the elders. But my dad would get on to me, and I would say, but Dad, Patrick got a C. I got a B. And my dad would always say, I'm not Patrick's father. Of course, I would walk away going, I wish you weren't mine. I mean, from an early age, we are taught to compete and compare. And we do that in every way possible. We compare what everybody else has. As small children, it may begin with this idea of which child is loved more. As students, we get into some group project and we complain about how we did the lion's share of the work and nobody else helped, and look at all of that, but we all get the same grade. And as employees, we do the same thing. We look at the team and we think about our own value, and maybe we didn't get promoted or whatever it is, and we compare ourselves to everybody else, and we're constantly doing that. And we do that in the church. We compare ourselves and see who's the better teacher or the better song leader or praise better prayers, which usually means shorter. We compare ourselves about who gets recognized publicly. We complain about, well, you recognize that person for doing something, and I've never been in the bulletin, which, by the way, read The Prodigal Son. That sounds a lot like that other brother. And this is an issue, by the way, with the disciples, wasn't it? I mean, Mark 9:33 through 34, they come to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, what were you discussing on the way? But they kept silence, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. And you think about the issue with James and John when, this is my favorite, their mom comes and asks for them to get special treatment. Listen, when you're old enough to follow Jesus and leave home, don't send your mom to do your job. But mom comes in and asks for special accommodations. And it's interesting, in Matthew 20 and verse 24, it says, when the 10 heard it, they were indignant at the 2 brothers. And I wondered if they were indignant that they asked or indignant that they hadn't thought of getting their mom to ask Jesus first. By the way, that in the upper room, they're still arguing about who's the greatest. And you would have thought by now that they would have learned to stop looking around at everybody else and just focus on Jesus and go where He tells you to go and do what He tells you to do. And it's at this point I want you to learn something. There is a part where our walk with Jesus as a disciple is deeply personal, meaning my walk is not like your walk. They're not all going to look the same. And one of the things about that is that our walk, which means we should all believe the same things essentially, and that we share the gospel with others in the same way. But even in that point, some of us do that more openly than others. Some of us do that more effectively than others. Some of us understand that more than others. And yet none of that matters as long as we just follow Jesus. You don't get special recognition in eternity for conversions. Just follow Jesus and glorify God. And you know the greatest problem about this is when we do this, when we start comparing about who's better at this and who's better at that, we've taken all of the glory from God and we're heaping it on ourselves. Look what I can do. Look who I am. Look how good I am. Did you see what I did? Lord, I thank you that I'm not like this tax collector. I tithe, I fast. See that, Lord? I'm not a sinner like you. Sermon on the Mount, Jesus told us in Matthew 5 and verse 16, in the same way, let your light shine before others so that He may see your good works and give glory. You don't shine your light so that you get recognized. Shine your light, why? To glorify God. So people see God. Our reward is from God. Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount that if you seek praise here, that's going to be your reward. And over in Colossians chapter 3, Paul told the Colossian brethren in verse 17, whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through Him. And then in verse 23, whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord, not men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. And at the end of the day, our job is not to go, well, what about this guy? What about that guy? What about Scott? There's like 3 of them, right? 4. I don't know how many there are. What about Steve? What about Keith? What is that to you? Follow me. Do your work. Glorify God. Walk in the steps of Jesus. And you will receive your reward. I just want to leave you with this. Walk your walk with Christ. I want to make sure this is clear. Because I was afraid sometimes we hear people use this terminology and we hear them say things and we think they're saying something else. Let me make this clear. I am not suggesting that your walk with Jesus is so deeply personal that you are saved in a different way than anybody. That is not what I am saying. I am not saying that your walk with Jesus is so deeply personal that it is some felt kind of emotional response. That is not what I'm saying. It does not mean that you can practice some different form of faith or doctrine that's not found in Jesus' teaching. That is not what I'm saying. There is one gospel. I mean, Ephesians 4, there is one body, one spirit, just as you were called to one hope that belongs to your call, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who's over all and through all. There are those 7 ones, and we just start there. You have got to agree on what those things mean with what the scriptural pattern says. Jude 3, that this faith has been delivered once for all. I am not denying that there is truth, and we must respond to the truth with full obedience and acceptance and submission to God, fully to God. But we are told that we will have different gifts and different abilities, and I will add to that, that's not on the screen, even at times I think different purposes. It is not in man to know the way of his steps. In Romans chapter 12 and verse 3, Paul told the brethren there, "For the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. For in one body we have many members, and the members do not have the same function. So we, though many, are one body in Christ, and individually members one of another, having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us. Let us use them. If prophecy in proportion to our faith, if service in our serving, the one who teaches in his teaching, the one who exhorts in his exhortation, the one who contributes in his generosity, the one who leads with zeal, the one who does acts of mercy with cheerfulness." I don't know what you read there, but I read there, you are going to be different. Just like the human body, it's made up of all of these limbs and organs designed by God to fulfill specific obligations and functions. Your arms are expected to work differently than your legs. And you need all of the things that God has designed your body with to perform the task that it's been given. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't use your arms to walk if that's what you had to do. It doesn't mean that if you, like my father-in-law, lose one of your legs, you don't learn to walk with the assistance of a prosthetic leg or something along those lines. It doesn't mean you can adapt if someone's not doing their job. But that's not the way God wanted it to work. Each part has to do it. 1 Corinthians 12, when he talks to them about these spiritual gifts, when he talks about the same analogy, he says the body doesn't consist of one member, but of many. If the foot should say, "Because I'm not a hand, I do not belong to the body," that would not make it any less part of the body. And if the ear should say, "Because I'm not an eye, I do not belong to the body," that would not make it any less part of the body. If the whole body were the eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would be the sense of smell? But as it is, God arranged the members in the body, each one of them as he chose. If all were a single member, where would the body be? There are many parts, yet one body. Kind of a ridiculous analogy, isn't it? Like if your arms said, "I don't need the legs to walk anymore. Let's cut our legs off. We don't need them. Let's amputate them. They're optional." What do you mean they're optional? It sounds foolish to us. How many times have we heard stories within a group of God's people where one group of people thinks the other group of people are unnecessary or less important or less spiritual? Ephesians 4, Paul says we grow into our best service and everything works. There in verse 15, speaking the truth in love, we're to grow up in every way into him who's the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body joined, held together by every joint with which it is equipped, when each part is working properly, makes the body. When all of the parts come together and they work the right way, us fulfilling our role, not comparing and wondering why I don't get to be a hand or an ear or an eye or the nose. If we will just focus on where we are, that doesn't mean you can't grow where you're at, but you have to serve in the role you're in. Walk with Christ. And walk your walk. I want to tell you something. There's a day of reckoning coming. In Matthew 25, there is that story in verses 14 through 30 of the parable of the talents. Turn over there, Matthew 25. Let's read that. We referenced that earlier this week. I want to read that with you. Starting in verse 14. For it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He had received the 5 talents, went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also the one who had 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of the servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I've made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been fruitful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he who had 2 talents came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I've made 2 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. I'll make you faithful over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He also who'd received the 1 talent came forward saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has the 10, but to everyone who has will be given, and he who has an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Can't go too in depth, but first off, there's a day of reckoning in verse 19. Coming a day when we'll answer for how well we have served the Lord. He's going to expect us to explain that to him and to be productive. And I want to tell you something. If you go up and you say, he says, what have you done with my talent? Well, Lord, I didn't like the talent you gave me because Johnny had a different talent I wanted. I did nothing. Think that's going to work. Secondly, these servants are only expected to do what they can do. They were expected to take what was given to them and use it to the best way. But the master doesn't say, well, servant with 2 talents, the guy with 5 got me 5. Why didn't you give me 5? They were given different amounts. And they weren't judged equally. They were judged based on what they had done with what they have. They were only expected to use what they had to glorify and serve the master. Third, our fears are not an excuse to fail. I mean, in one sense, the third guy is kind of, in our minds, sometimes the right way. Well, better be safe than sorry. Let's bury that talent. Let's make sure we don't lose it. The master says, no. Condemned for that. By the way, let me take a moment here to talk about evangelism. Because I'm convinced that all of us, if we have given our life over to God through Christ, to be redeemed by his blood, we should be able to at least explain to somebody else why that is. And yet I hear people tell me all the time, well, preacher, what if I say something wrong? What if somebody asks me about why I'm a Christian and I say it wrong and I mess up? What if I don't say anything? And my response is, if you allow that fear to stop you from talking about Jesus, you are the 1 talent man. If you're so afraid that God is going to send you to outer darkness for saying something wrong, trying to glorify Him. So you just do nothing and bury the word in your backyard till the day of reckoning. You are going to hear apart from it. I'm not expecting you to teach a Bible class. I'm not expecting you to preach a sermon. I'm not expecting you to know the book in and out from the beginning. But I will tell you this, if you know enough to turn your life over to God, to obey the truth, to follow what Jesus said in your life, know enough to tell somebody why you did it. And it doesn't have to be perfect. You know how many typos alone in my 26 years of preaching I've had on PowerPoint? In fact, I should try that. Somebody says, well, we want you to do PowerPoint. Afraid I might type the wrong thing. I'm not going to use it. The reality, in my understanding of this parable, is if the one talent man came up and said, Lord, I invested it, but we actually lost the talent, that would have been more acceptable. Fourth, Jesus, in this story, they don't compare the three servants. There's no comparison. And finally, useful servants are useful to the master. You want to be useful to God? Serve where you're at. Walk your walk. One of the things I think is really a problem is sometimes we're looking at things we want to do and we're not doing the things that we can do already. Instead of thinking about something else you want to do, just take today to work where you can already work. Serve God in a way you can already serve. I always have these young men sometimes will come up and go, I want to be an elder one day. And I'm like, well, start teaching then. You want to be an elder, why aren't you teaching Bible class? Instead of looking that far forward, work where you're at. You don't leap from showing up on Sunday morning once a week for an hour to the eldership. That's not how that works. Teach, work, love the people, build relationships, glorify God. By this all will know that you're my disciple, that you have love for your brother. Love your brother. That's your walk. Walk your walk. Lord, what about John? What does that mean? Don't look at John. Don't worry yourself about John. You follow. Let Jesus rule. Ultimately, that's what we've been talking about all week. When you think about Jesus being the Lord of your life, what you're talking about is He has the right to tell you where to go, what to do, and even how to do it. And by the way, when I say walk your walk, I'm not saying you're going to get some special revelation outside of the Scripture. But we sing songs like, Lead Me to Some Soul Today. We ask God to help us to find someone to help. I got to tell you, all those things are already around us. Let's open our eyes. And we would see that helping our neighbor, talking to our neighbor about the gospel, is what it really looks like following His steps. What about you? Are you really following Jesus? By the way, I hope you know something. That's way more. Following Jesus is way more than just showing up when the doors are open. Following Jesus and living out our faith is something we have to do when we're not in this room. We're at home, we're at work, we're at school. Because if we let our light shine here only, we're just hiding it under a basket. It's got to shine when you leave. So I leave you with that challenge this week. Walk your walk. Follow Him. Let's stand and let's sing this song.